I entered the living room carrying the blanket on my right arm. It was a woolen, hand-knitted patchwork of green, brown, and blue colors. It hung from my arm, weighting it down, skimming right over the wooden boarded floor, but without ever dragging on it. I walked slowly, deliberately. There was a certain ritualistic approach to my movements. There had to be. The living room was lit in the orange glow coming through its single window, bathed in the colors of a Sunday afternoon. The dying of the day casting long shadows across the floor, across the table and couch. I paused briefly right in front of the brown couch, then turned on my feet and sit on it, placing the blanket on the seat next to me. Slowly, I leaned sideways and rested my head on the armrest. After a beat, I rose my legs and placed them on the couch too. I lay there, my body sprawled across the three seats. Of course, the piece of furniture wasn't as long as a bed, so I had to keep my knees somewhat bent to fit in it. The posture created a bit of a strain in the artificial muscular tissue that covered my legs, but it was supposed to do that. It was supposed to be ever so slightly uncomfortable, but not unpleasant enough that I would need to move and change posture. With a precise motion, I unfolded the blanket and covered my body with it, from the legs and up to my chest. I doubted for a moment whether to place my arms over or under the blanket, unsure as to which was the correct way to go about it. The perfect resting posture. Eventually, I left them uncovered. The TV in front of the couch was turned on, broadcasting some old show I haven't watched before, the images having that noisy grain that dated them to sometime during the 80s. Of course, it's not that I didn't know the name of the show, or its length, the actual date of airing of each of its 28 episodes. The one now playing on TV was the sixth dash, the name and date of birth of each of its leading actors, or where I had found the tapes, a television archive building in what had been the city of Atlanta, one that I had completely digitized before leaving Earth. But I tried to shy away from that knowledge, pretending I didn't know all that, pretending I had just turned on the TV, and this was what happened to be on it. It wasn't working, not fully, but it was as close as I dared going, short of intentionally deleting that knowledge from my databanks. Had I had eyelids, I would have them half closed by now. But the body I was controlling was just another one of my robotic soldiers, and I hadn't designed them with this purpose in mind. I could have turned off its two cameras, but it just wouldn't have felt the same. So I simply adjusted their focus until the image I got from them was slightly blurred. It would have to do. All of this was, of course, a crude mockery, a doomed attempt at recapturing a memory, at feeling again that sense of warmth, of calmness, that came with spending a Sunday afternoon lying on the sofa, balancing in that narrow, sweet spot between awareness and sleep. Except things were somewhat off. The room felt different somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on what was wrong. Was the ceiling just a bit too tall, or too short? How many inches had the TV screen had? How many feet had separated it from the couch? It felt as if someone had ran through my stuff and put everything out of place. I could tell things were wrong, but the memories weren't precise enough, clear enough, as to know how to fix those same mistakes. I knew the couch's fabric had had some sort of faded pattern, but I couldn't for the life of me recall what it had looked like. But the most glaring hole in the memory was the other presence that had been there with me. I knew I hadn't been alone when resting like this, drifting off to sleep. Someone had sat with me, on the same couch. I recalled jokes. I recalled someone massaging my legs. And yet I couldn't recall their face, their looks, who they had been. I knew that person had been important, but not why. This, the whole experience, was an exercise in frustration, in trying to reach at something that was always moving away, that slipped through my fingers the moment I thought I had a grasp on it. But it was important that I kept trying. It grated on me that the most vital memories, the ones tying me back to humanity, were also the most blurred ones, the most imprecise, the most filled with gaps. All the while I could construct a perfect replica of a Zunverian laser projector, down to the identifying serial codes in each electronic board. I was constructing them at that very moment, in fact, 416 of them to join my other 2,379 projectors I had already installed in drones and crafts across my fleet. I had been busy, even as I lay on the sofa, purposely not watching the TV. My awareness kept working on several simultaneous levels. I could see the outside of the living room, a plywood construction I had erected inside one of the smaller storage areas in my main body. I could see the space surrounding me, my extended panels bathed by the faint orange light of the twin stars at the center of the lumen system. I was aware of the more than 7 million machines that now compose my swarm. They were distributed across 3 stellar systems under my control, most of the drones tasked with different kinds of resource extraction: minerals, radioactive materials, gases, water, all the work, the extraction, transportation, refining, and construction of new units controlled by the central servers in my main body, instantaneously transmitting commands both through the EM spectrum and via my new quantum entangled relays. I had become a nation of a single mind. Paradoxically, I had the Zunvar Republic to thank for my exponential growth. It was the fusion plants of their own design that satisfied the increasing energy appetite of the swarm. It was their communication devices and optimized processing algorithms that allowed my brain to coordinate so many machines. It was their warp engines that had enabled me to expand beyond Earth's solar system. And more importantly, it was their past actions, their attack on Earth, that still fueled my determination. They had been aggressive at first, sending their warship squadrons after me. But they hadn't put a strong enough front, maybe not considering me an important threat, so it hadn't been hard to come out ahead. Then, they wised up, sending a strong and coordinated attack force to face me. Had they done that at the beginning, they could have won. But by the time they had reacted, I was already strong enough to stomp on their forces. After that, the Zunberians had shifted to a defensive stance, no doubt grouping around their nearest colony world. It would fall on me to start the next confrontation. All around me, my attack swarm gathered. More than 400,000 offensive drones and assault soldiers. There were so many of them that they looked like a moving fluid. The machines danced and flowed in tight fractal formations, following complex patterns that weaved them together without ever crashing into each other. They enveloped me like a living, metallic blanket, like some sort of twisted mirroring of what was happening inside the plywood room. There were so many of them that it was impossible for me to stuff them into my main body anymore. Transportation, and not manufacturing, now marked the limits of my attack strength. So I had resorted to building support carrier ships. At roughly 2 kilometers long each, the support ships featured a miniaturized version of my own body design, with compartments for carrying drones and soldiers, but also assembly factories, raw material storage areas, shield projectors, power plants, laser weaponry, and warp drives. The only thing missing was a mind of their own. Just like the drones themselves, the support ships were under my direct control, an extension of myself rather than separate entities. That was another of the boundaries, another line I wasn't willing to cross. I wouldn't give self-awareness to what I intend to use as a mere weapon of war. Like the drones, the support ships were disposable too, which meant I couldn't just send my swarm to attack while I stayed put behind, safe within my control territories. Even the quantum relays weren't perfect. Their bandwidth was limited. And if I tried to directly control the complex interwoven movements of hundreds of thousands of drones through them, there would be several seconds of delay before my orders reached their recipients. A delay that could cost me a battle. No, I would need to be in the front lines, directing the machine's movements with precision, risking my own body. I guessed I could have built backup servers in my stellar systems, though. Some sort of failsafe, a clone of my mind that would persist even if my main body was destroyed. It would be the smart thing to do, the optimal, but I didn't like it, the idea of my consciousness being some fluid thing, the idea of losing contact by mistake and coming back to find out another me had taken over. Stupid? Perhaps. I knew I was putting obstacles in my own way, deliberately falling short of my full potential, but I felt I needed these acres, to prevent me from going down the ever-dangerous slope. Vengeance was important. But so was remaining human, not losing myself, because as long as I did, as long as I could keep me from becoming something else, then humanity itself would exist with me. There would still be a faint glimmer of hope. As long as I was human, then we wouldn't be extinct. So I couldn't afford to be consumed, to turn into a mindless weapon of mass destruction. That didn't mean I planned to die anytime soon, though. I had upgraded my body, improved its armor with the new material techniques I had developed, installed shield projectors based on Zunberian designs, and a warp drive that was currently charging for the imminent faster-than-light trip. I commanded the support ships to spool their warp drives too. Turned out warp tunneling was dependent on mass. The bigger the object, the more power it required. And having to move a 27 kilometers long object, the warp drive in my main body had some crazy energy requirements. It took my power plant several minutes to feed it before each activation. I felt nervous as I secured the last of my drones in their compartments. As I sent the orders that the factories and the other machines I was leaving behind would follow in my absence. It was always like this before a trip, but this time I knew it would be harder. I would be jumping straight into a battlefield, into an enemy trap. Steeling myself, I activated the warp drives. Right away, I went blind and deaf, losing contact with the rest of my machines. I was now only aware of the drones within my own body. There was no way to communicate to the external world while in warp. It made me feel small. I was getting used to my expanded awareness, to being present across different stellar systems, to the almost omniscient view I had over my domains. This, going back to the constraints of a single view, the physical limits of a single ship, felt almost like being caged. It made me feel anxious and vulnerable. The trip would only take about 20 minutes, but to the rest of the universe more than 3 days would have passed by the time I emerged back into normal space. I was all too aware of how defenseless my other machines would be during that time. They had their orders and were autonomous enough as to not stop in their tracks, but I couldn't kid myself. Should the Zonvirians choose to attack my solar systems now, my drones would be an easy prey without myself to direct them. It spoke volumes of why the Zonvirian fleets moved the way they did, continuously making short warp jumps rather than long leaps, like stones skipping on a lake surface, always popping in and out warp as to avoid unpleasant surprises. Sadly, it just wasn't a viable strategy for me. With my massive vehicles, each FTL ticket was an expensive investment with a long setup. Making too many of them would be prohibitive. There just wasn't anything I could do other than wait, cross my fingers, and hope that I wouldn't come out of warp to find my home razed and burned, so to speak. So I waited, going over possible attack plans and flying patterns. Meanwhile, in the living room, I shifted my body to relieve the strain in my legs. Leaving warp was as sudden as entering it had been. One moment I was blind, the next I could see. Millions of machines popping into my awareness, petabytes of information being downloaded into my brain as the pending logs finally reached me. My mind started working, shifting through the enormous pile of data, discarding irrelevant information and integrating the important bits into my memory banks. To my conscious mind, it felt as if I had never left. I had perfect recollection of everything that happened in my absence. All the while I perfectly remembered being in warp, unable to communicate. It was yet another of the oddities of my strange new nature. I went through my memories of the last 3 days. A couple factories had stopped production due to running out of input materials. 17 drones had been destroyed in a pipe collapse in the Centauri system. More than 4,000 others had landed in their respective home hangars after encountering maintenance problems of some kind or other. Nothing to worry about. I absent-mindedly sent the commands to deal with each of the situations and focused my attention on my immediate surroundings. The colony world floated at 80,000 kilometers away from me, the sphere of green, brown, and blue hues. Its bright, colorful tones contrasted with the pure black of space, making it stand out like a floating jewel. It was beautiful. It only served to make me angrier. That it was just like Earth had once looked. That the Zonvirians got to enjoy this safe, beautiful world even after having wrecked ours. That crimes didn't have any repercussions. That the universe, that life itself, kept going on in spite of our tragedy. That we had been forgotten. No, that wouldn't do. In orbit, right between the planet and my own position, there was the Zonvirian fleet. With 13 battleships and their escorting vessels, it was the largest combined fleet I had ever faced so far. And they had, indeed, wised up. Their warships groups were arrayed in a large arching formation, leaving tens of kilometers of empty space between each other. Making sure, I noticed, that I wouldn't be able to wrap them all in the thick of my swarm at the same time. The enemy started to react, turning their flanks toward me, but they hadn't opened fire yet. Holding formation, they showered me in messages, transmissions asking for a truce, for a negotiation. I gave those the same treatment that humanity's own pleas had been given. I weighed my options. Their plan, I realized, was both simple and hard to counter. If I tried to attack them all at the same time, my machines would be too dispersed to be effective. That meant I would need to work my way through their ships instead, one after the other. But focusing my strength in a single target would free the other enemies to flank me and shoot at both me and my drones from the safety of distance, using the greater range of their energy weapons. Could I win? Yes, maybe. My own body was now protected by shields specifically designed to withstand laser fire. And even though the drones were vulnerable, at the end of the day I had the advantage of numbers, of very large numbers. So probably I would have enough drones as to work through their entire fleet ship by ship and come out victorious. But the losses would be astonishing. Most if not all my machines would be destroyed in the process. My body would need repairs. I could win, but would that be a worthwhile victory, or just a losing strategy? One that could make me weaker in the long run, unable to survive at some critical juncture in the future. I could just ignore their warships and dive in for the kill. Send all my swarm to ravage the world they were tasked with protecting. They wouldn't be able to stop me. But then, what? After I destroyed their world, I would still need to face off their warships. Running away wasn't an option given how long my warp drive took to charge. And I'd be put into a worse tactical position, having already committed my army to a ground attack. What other options were there? Sending a couple drones armed with nuclear warheads towards each of their ships? No. It would be obvious, and the machines would be shot down long before they could reach their targets. Using nuclear drones was a collaborative task. One craft delivered the payload, while the rest provided cover, chaos, and decoys. But again, trying to do that simultaneously against all the enemy ships would disperse my swarm too thinly. It was self-defeating. So, yes, the Zunberian strategy was simple, but hard to counter. We stood there for a few instants of standoff, facing each other. No talking on my part, no radio communications. 3 seconds later, I was joined by my 8 support ships, popping out into normal space by my side. Deocat's legs hurt. It was a deep, constant pain that increased with every movement, accompanied by a stiffness that slowly but surely had spread to envelop his whole body over the last days. In a way, he was surprised. He had always been taught that his species had evolved to jog up and down the expansive grass hills of his home planet, and that this was the reason Sanxians were so good at walking in uneven terrain. Well, apparently someone forgot to tell that to Deocat's body. He had spent the last days a hostage of Yovitz's commissary of agriculture, the effusive, and surprisingly short, Zunberian, informing him of everything there was to know and more about farming and planting in a colony world. They had visited irrigation projects, oxygenic tree plantations, mountain farms, ground decalcification facilities, river fish farms, redgrass fields, poultry farms, valley sweet thorn cultivation works, and all the other places whose names Deocat couldn't and didn't care to remember. If he didn't know better, he would have thought the commissary suspected the visit motives were a fabrication and was punishing him for it. But no, either the Zunberian was a great actor, or his intentions were honest. And Deocat leaned towards the latter. There simply was a certain mindset to people who willingly chose to move to a new world. A colony in the periphery of the Republic, which itself was in the periphery of the galaxy. To a world in development, without the comforts of civilization. Colonies attracted a certain kind of people. Honest, enthusiast, and hardworking. A mindset that was increasingly rare among the inhabitants of the large metropolis where Deocat had spent most of his formative years. He walked up to his room's window and looked at Yovitz's biggest, and to his opinion, only city. The town's location had been carefully chosen. It was built in a natural bay that gave its settlers access to the planet's single large ocean, but whose surrounding mountains protected it from the worst of the seasonal storms that periodically battered the continent. It was a mix and match of prefabricated boxy white houses, warehouses, and workshops. Here and there, high-rise constructions of bare concrete and steel emerged from the sea of houses, such as the lodging he was staying at. He refused to dignify the place by referring to it as a hotel. The wide avenues, decorated with the local lush trees, only made the lack of actual motorized traffic even more apparent. While the main city enjoyed far more activity than the other towns Deocat had been recently visiting, it would be a far call to say it was bustling. In some sense, Deocat felt as if he had somehow traveled back in time. or was visiting some sort of pre-spacefaring civilization. The town, the whole colony, had an outdated air to it. The avenues would suddenly turn into dirt roads, forcing the ground vehicles to default to dangerous manual piloting. Or sometimes he would come across a small house made entirely out of wood, of all things. It made for an odd contrast with the scattered displays of high technology he could glimpse at times. The recycling plants in particular were state-of-the-art even by council standards. And the spaceport, right across the street from the building he was at, featured an endless showcase of modern Zonvirian starships entering and leaving the planet's atmosphere. He could even see the embassy's ship, the white wedge-shaped vehicle with gold accents and elegant designs etched in its surface that Stanley and him had used to get there. It was parked right at the edge of the enormous bare expanse of asphalt that was Yovid's only spaceport. He glanced across the bay towards the Colonial Directorate building, where his boss was at the moment. Always one step ahead. Stanley had excused herself out of the agrarian excursion and decided to stay at the Directorate, visiting the local governors and high-ranking officers. The reasoning, she had explained to him in private, was that should the planet be attacked, its defense would be coordinated out of that building. Being there when that happened, she had said, would give them first-hand information on Zunver's enemies. Dalcat suspected her true reasons had more to do with aching legs and long-winded explanations on water reprocessing techniques. He relaxed his eye membranes, letting them water his tired eyes, and slowly sat down in the room's only chair, which creaked under his weight, the cursed thing. Letting out a breath, he activated his augmented irises and started going through the documents in the work he had been neglecting for the past days. He was reading a long-winded explanation of the Republic's proposed amendment to the export treaties, trying for the second time to unpack a particularly annoying sentence when a link to his boss opened. "Hi, Dalcat," she said. "Have any plans for this afternoon?" Even when sub-vocalizing, Dalcat could pick up on a terse tone. Or maybe he was just imagining things. "Yes, actually, I'm visiting an animal food reprocessing facility. Why don't you join me? I'm sure you'll enjoy it," he replied, half-jokingly. Maybe you should consider getting a sprained tendon or something. Stay here this afternoon?" He paused. No, he hadn't imagined anything. Something was going on. Wait, is it happening now? As the only response, he received a vidlink. He opened it, a floating screen only he could see appearing in midair. It was a direct feed from her irises, showing him what she was seeing. Stanley was at some sort of control room, standing next to a large screen along a group of Zonvirian colonial officers. The screen showed a view of Yovid from orbit, the fleet of defensive military ships clearly visible, and a purple icon, indicating an incoming warp tunnel, Dalcat muttered. "Yes, time to collapse is 3 hours. It could be a civilian vessel, but no flight plan," he ventured, reading the screen. All civilian ships were supposed to relay their warp jump plans to the authorities ahead of time. No. They remained in silence for a few seconds. "Should I join you there?" he said at last. "No. You're one street away from the spaceport as it is. If we have to evacuate, go to our ship and wait for me there." He nodded, then muttered an affirmative when he realized she couldn't see him. "Keep this vidlink open, though," she added. They went back to a tense silence, watching the countdown timer. Meanwhile, Dalcat composed a short message to the Commissary of Agriculture, excusing himself out of the afternoon's activities. A sprained tendon. Sometime later, he watched through Stanley's feed as a group of military officers entered the control room and started evicting all the civilians. They tried to kick her out of the room too, but she very calmly declared having direct authorization by the Emperor himself to oversee any military operations. Dalcat snorted, but the Zonvirians appeared to buy the bluff and let her stay. Or maybe they just had more urgent stuff to worry about. In the screen, the timer was down to 1 hour. Dalcat opened the large cabinet in his room and took a small travel bag. He placed in it the synthetic food bars and medical supplies that he always traveled with in case of an emergency. Then, he added some extra clothing items and the energy handgun all Council Embassy members were issued with, just in case. Half an hour. The Zonvirian fleet had adopted a strange and very sparse formation in front of the warp tunnel's estimated exit point. Dowcat absent-mindedly looked up at the sky from his window, but of course he couldn't see anything. Just a blue sky with some puffy white clouds. In the avenue outside, the sparse traffic flowed as usual. Dowcat almost expected sirens to have gone off by now, but it seemed the Zunberians were either confident they would come ahead, or they were still playing their cards close to their chests. He wondered if his and Noxtani's presence in the colony had anything to do with that. It's not like there were many places for the locals to take refuge in, though. Their best option would be running out of the city and into the farmlands and mountains surrounding it. Evacuating the planet, as always, was also out of the question. In the history of the Council, many military leaders had proposed plans for evacuating worlds in case of a military attack, but invariably they tended to be infeasible. Planets with large populations were simply impossible to evacuate in time, even when dedicating entire transport fleets to the task. And colonies like Yovid had most of their population dispersed across the land, in places where transportation was spotty and there was no easy access to a spaceport. And even if there had been a way to evacuate the civilians, they'd be put in orbit, right in the middle of the upcoming space battle, right where they could be easily captured or mistaken for combatant vessels. No, the best recommendation in case of a planetary assault was to hunker down and weather the worst of it. Civilians were usually respected, and eventually wars ended, treaties were signed, and a solution was reached for the local populations. If the Terrans won here, they'd take over the colony and set their own interim government that could last months. It would give Noxtani and him the opportunity to talk formally with the newly discovered species, while also overseeing the Zunberian population wasn't mistreated. But it wouldn't hurt to be prepared in case they had to hunker down themselves, he thought, eyeing the travel bag. Or if Noxtani decided it would be better to leave the planet altogether and take their chances up in orbit. Soon after the counter had reached 20 minutes, the screen shifted from the orbital view to a detailed zoomed-in visual of the projected exit point. 10 minutes. Even through the feed, Dowcat could feel how tense Noxtani was. No joking this time. 5 minutes. Dowcat closed his travel bag and placed it in the center of the room, sitting back in the chair. He glanced at the cabinet and the expensive outfits he would be leaving behind, but quickly focused back on the vid link. 1 minute. Noxtani let out a breath. Dowcat realized he was holding one of his own. 30 seconds. This was it. 10. He watched as the countdown timer went through the last numbers. 5. His eye membranes contracted almost on their own, as if to protect the delicate eyeballs. 3, 2, 1, 0. The instant seemed to stretch, lasting forever, as if they were caught inside some sort of time dilation effect. And for a single, hopeful moment, Dowcat was sure that the timer would update again to simply show +1, the Terrans having missed their appointment. And then time would return to its normal speed, and he would relax and Noxtani would make some joke at the image in the screen changed. The first thought was one of incomprehension. Dowcat had expected an enemy fleet to pour out of warp, with battleships and escorting cruisers and formations and all that. But that wasn't what had happened. No, clearly there was something out there, but he couldn't make sense of the image. Then, the view zoomed out, putting the image in context. And he understood. It was impossible, of course. They would have known. The Galactic Council would have known. Were there a civilization in the Orion Arm capable of building such a thing? The amount of resources involved, the amount of time, of energy to put that monster into space. And yet, there it was. A starship the size of a city, as in defiance to the laws of physics and economics. Many expletives crossed his mind, competing for attention, but somehow he couldn't opt for just one of them. There wasn't a word to reflect the astonishment, the complete impossibility of the scene, so he remained silent. Noxtani, of course, didn't have such problems. Just who these cursed mulch-smoking bastards picked a fight with, she was muttering. He was still trying to process the implications when the image changed again. New ships joining the oversized monster. It now looked closer to what Dowcat had originally expected. A flagship with its escorting vessels. Except that each of the smaller vehicles were large enough as to qualify as flagships on their own. Larger than any capital ship in any of the fleets of the nations that formed the Galactic Council. Odds were, he realized, that he was looking at the 9 biggest starships in the entire galaxy. He said to no one. And then, Just as Dowcat thought, he couldn't be more surprised. The screen started filling in hundreds, thousands, tens of thousands of icons as new contacts appeared. Entire waves of smaller vehicles coming out of the larger ships. There were so many of them the sensors couldn't keep pace. The red icons moved and danced around the massive vessels as if they were schools of fish around a giant sea creature. Like a swarm. There wasn't any better word to describe it. He absent-mindedly noticed he was back to a standing position, having left the chair at some point during the last moments. But he paid it no attention. In the screen, the Terrans were beginning their attack, moving as a large group towards one of the defending battleships, apparently chosen at random. Are the Zunvirians trying to contact them? Dowcat asked. Yes, his boss replied. I got them to add our own message too, but no response so far. Dowcat felt a strange anger at the developing situation. It almost seemed obscene to use such a display of force, to make such an overwhelmingly powerful attack against such a small colony world, as if the Terrans had no sense of proportion whatsoever. The reasoning for the Zunvirians' weird formation became quickly apparent as the rest of their warships moved towards the flanks of the enemy, encircling the swarm and opening fire on it with all their energy weapons at the same time. Dozens of beams crisscrossing the intervening empty space. The screen struggled to reflect the amount of Terran casualties, the hundreds of ships that they were losing under the hell of combined laser fire the Zunvirians were unleashing upon them. It appeared the smaller Terran crafts weren't protected by any kind of shields. But still, the blob didn't seem to thin, stoically enduring the assault without ever slowing its advance. With a shiver, Dowcat wondered if each of those small crafts was carrying a pilot. If so, retaining such level of discipline under the conditions they were being subjected to would speak volumes about the Terran mindset. Would they use some sort of brainwashing, conditioned training, drugs? Were they some society built on honor and total obedience? On a complete negation of the individual needs for the good of the collective? Somehow, he doubted they would be piloted. It was easier to refuse the idea that any sentient being would allow being subjected to that. But his memory reminded him that the swarm's target, the Zunvirian battleship that had been singled out by the Terrans and had submitted itself to its role as bait, was definitely piloted by a crew. He muttered a curse. Dowcat had always known there was something strangely horrifying about war, some kind of rational madness to it. But seeing it play out in front of him was quite a different beast than learning about it from the safety of a philosophical essay. He saw as the Terran crafts finally reached their objective and began to slowly envelop the doomed battleship, and then things started happening very fast. A white flash in the screen marked the disappearance of the targeted ship, along with a small chunk of the enemy swarm. A few instants later, 7 more flashes followed, each at the position of a close Zunvirian vessel. Nogstani pronounced the words, nuclear weapons. Dowcat's mind raced to consider the diplomatic consequences of detonating thermonuclear ordnance in the orbit of an inhabited green world, in direct contravention of the most fundamental war treaties of the Galactic Federal Council. But he abandoned that train of thought as he saw the 8 massive Terran escorting ships do something impossible. All of a sudden, they shot out of the main blob at an astonishing speed. Their acceleration so disproportionately high he wasn't sure how the ship's structures could even handle such extreme forces, let alone how whatever crew was manning them hadn't just been instantly turned into paste. Each of them was aiming towards one of the main Zunvirian battleships, the ones that had stood out of range of the swarm during the entire battle, the ones that housed the fleet admirals and tactical command centers. The Terran ships had crossed most of the empty space, separating them from the battleships in just a couple of seconds. But they didn't stop. They just kept accelerating, homing in on their targets. One instant too late, Dowcat realized they didn't intend to stop. The Terrans were using their own ships as oversized battering rams, as missiles. In his mind, that cinched it. The Terrans were lunatics, a berserk species that lacked any moral consideration towards the lives of even their own crews. The Zunvirian battleships had too been caught by surprise at the strange maneuver. They fired their thrusters, desperately trying to get out of the way, but they just couldn't match the maddening levels of acceleration of their Terran counterparts. A moment later, Dowcat stared in disbelief as the information representing the targeted vessels simply vanished from the screen. Noxtani's terse voice interrupted the feed. Dowcat, she said, not bothering to sub-vocalize. We are evacuating. Go to the spaceport, get into our ship, and come pick me up here. As if on cue, the rest of the Terran swarm exploded, small dots flying everywhere, towards each and one of the remaining Zonvirian ships, even towards the planet itself. Dowcat noted as he reached for his travel bag and left the room, his heart beating fast. The Zonvirian careful formation was in shambles. Amazingly, half of the Terran giant escort ships had survived their respective impacts and were coming in for a second pass. The defending fleet was disorganized, some ships turning to respond to this new menace, others trying to contain the rising tide of the swarm. A series of white flashes followed, and more signal icons simply disappeared. Noxtani's vidlink started freezing and losing visual coherence, interferences continuously blocking the image and sound now. Right, Dowcat thought. All those nuclear explosions must have been bathing the planet in a storm of electromagnetic pulses, and their communicators just weren't designed to operate under such conditions. Scampering down the stairs, he closed the video feed to save bandwidth, keeping the audio link still opened. He looked back at the sky as soon as he exited the building. A mesmerizing green and red aurora covered the whole horizon, north to south. It was slowly spreading, dancing lazily far above the clouds. Dowcat ran towards the adjacent spaceport, dodging the locals who stood motionless all over the street looking at the sky. He didn't fault them, though. The sight was beautiful, in a horrifying kind of way. He heard the sudden voice of his boss. Dowcat, she all but screamed. We got to end. Repeat that, he said. The link is cutting. Said, Warren, ship. Dowcat eyed again the now turning purple sky. What had she said? Something about the ship? He was now running past the large landing gear of the giant commercial freighters, parked all over the place. His legs burned with the overexertion, each step sending pain through his whole body. Yes, I'm almost at the ship, he screamed back into the communicator. He could see his target, the embassy ship. He rushed towards its boarding ramp, from where one of the support staff was signaling him to move faster. Noxtani had probably contacted them too, because the vehicle's engines were already turned on, filling the air with their piercing noise, raising a cloud of dust and wind that tugged at Dowcat's clothes and buffeted his exposed silvery skin. Noxtani, he said as he climbed the ramp and entered the vehicle. We should try contacting the Terrans using the ship's quantum relay. Maybe we can still negotiate a truce, or stop them from shooting us down once we get up there. I don't listen. You need to warn the council. A Type G emerge. It's an expo. Had she just said Type G emergency? Dowcat moved towards the front of the ship, his steps muffled by the carpeted floors. He had to use his hands to grasp at the door handles and walls to keep his balance, as the spaceship was already starting its ascent. It's a what? He asked. An X-8er. The link died. He was still trying to decipher Noxtani's words when he reached the ship's narrow cockpit. He all but climbed into the free seat next to the only pilot, a young female Dypheniard whose attention was currently focused on manually operating the vehicle. Her short brown coat of fur puffed up. Somehow, Dowcat doubted this takeoff was following proper procedures. Noxtani had said to warn the council. A Type G emergency. Type G. An event with the potential to cause grave loss of life and property across the entirety of the Galactic Federal Council and its associated states. Type GS were an almost theoretical concept. Only one had ever been formally declared in the history of the Galactic Council, when an artificially engineered virus had spread across 7 stellar systems, menacing to kill hundreds of millions. Declaring one here seemed excessive, even after witnessing the Terran's actions. So, what else had Noxtani seen? Dowcat engaged the ship's quantum relay from his console and started inputting his identification code. He glanced out of the cockpit's windows as he waited for the link to establish. The ship was now skimming the roofs of the city's houses, moving towards the monolith of the Directorate building. He saw local Zonvirians in the streets, turning to run towards nearby houses. Had the colonial authorities sounded the alarm? A few stopped to look at the passing vehicle, moving out of the way of the little tornado its engines were creating. The console pinged, waiting for him to talk. This is Assistant Ambassador Dowcat, he said. Code 376 Sphere. Speaking on behalf of Ambassador Noxtani, Code 939 Sphere. I'm declaring a Type G emergency originating at the Zunva Republic, Yovit system. He didn't miss the bewildered glance the pilot gave him. The console pinged again. The message had been parsed by the automatic receiver. The link was redirecting. Up above, there were dozens of white trail lines slowly crisscrossing the sky. There was something else Noxtani had saw. What had she tried to say? An expo? An expo what? And just then, he remembered something. Terran. That was what the Corvette captain had said, back at the Empyrean Palace. Terran. Not Terrans. One. Singular. The Terran. A voice came out of the console. This is Permanent Security Dispatch speaking to Assistant Ambassador Daukat. Please confirm declaration of Type G emergency. Type G emergency confirmed, he replied. Concise and to the point. Always be concise when speaking to dispatch, Noxtani had once told him. Describe it. The Zunva Republic has been attacked by an exponential replicator, codenamed Terran. Replicator appears to be intelligent and of artificial nature, and does not respond to communication attempts. Replicator is already in control of 3, correction, for stellar sys. Light, a deafening noise, a roaring shadow darkening it all. A fleeting moment of surprise as left became down and right became up, rolling, crashing, a searing flash of pain crossing his mind. Darkness. If you like the video, please consider leaving a like. Subscribe for more.